Professor Ashwath Damodharan joins me from the Stern Business School of New York University. Appreciate your joining us, Professor Damodharan, taking the time off. My first question, and this is something everyone is asking. The Hindenburg Research report says Adani is the biggest con in history. What do you think? You've gone and detailed it in a fantastic blog post. Now share your views with our viewers. Do you think that Adani is a con or not?
I think that's hyperbole. I mean, a con to me is something where there's no substance. A Ponzi scheme is a con. There's nothing there. The entire objective is to fool people, separate them from their money, and leave them poor. And I don't think Adani fits that description. I think it has too much substance as a company to be a con. And I think, in a sense, what Adani has done in the interests of preserving control has fed into the Hindenburg reports. Okay, so the reason people are willing to listen is because of some of the actions that Adani has taken, not so much because they wanted to con people, but because they were so interested in preserving control at the company. It's sometimes in their zeal to keep control at companies, I think family groups get a little carried away. They take actions that are not about ripping other people off. It's about preserving control. And when I look at Adani's actions, even if everything in the Hindenburg report is true, and it might not or might not be, it could still be contested, what I see is the picture of a company that is so focused on family group members keeping control that it's probably cut corners, taken decisions that are designed to advance it on that objective. But to call it a con, I think, it's hyperbole. So short sellers do it all the time. I'm not surprised the Hindenburg report does this, because I've seen short reports before. They have to catch your attention, and it did, right? And you see that headline, you say, oh, there must be something here that is essentially designed to rip off people, so let me go see what it is.
So the first answer to the FAQ, you're saying the Hindenburg report is hyperbole when it says Adani Group is a con job, but the group could have cut corners in your view. Let's turn to the second most frequently answered question, Professor Damodharan. The most serious allegation in that report was of stock manipulation, of using inter-party, inter-family transactions to perhaps make the company look more creditworthy, and importantly, create a maze of shell companies controlled by family members and thereby, in a way, engaging possibly in round tripping and a violation of rules. Do you believe that these allegations in the report are serious enough to merit a proper investigation?
See, I don't know. The web of shell companies, it's unlikely that the Hindenburg report made it out of thin air. Because this is, I mean, in fact, as I read the Hindenburg report, I went back and checked prior reports in the Indian press. Almost everything in that report is, in a sense, almost in the public domain. Nothing there was something that people say, I'd never heard of that before. There are 6,300 companies in Mauritius. It's a company with $11.5 billion GDP. You're saying, what the heck are 6,300 companies doing in there? This is a place where Indian businesses go, and we can debate that this is moral or ethical, or the Indian government knows this, right? It's been trying to crack down on it. So is it possible that the Adani Group has 38 shell companies in Mauritius? Yes. That part of it. So even if that allegation is right, let's talk about the price manipulation part. This is the part that I don't get. This is not a small company. It's a company with small float, but it's a company whose market cap increased by $100 billion. To do that, you need a lot of trading. So what I was looking for in the report is show me the evidence of trading jumping tenfold. In the last 18 months, the price was going up. Maybe you have some evidence that shows me that the trading volume was 20 times higher than before. I didn't see that evidence. Almost all the evidence is about shell companies that are essentially Adani shells that hold shares in the company. Here's the part of the report that I'm willing to believe. That 75% threshold, that's a listing requirement to be I am willing to believe that Adani has played fast and loose with that rule. Mm-hmm. This is a control fixation. You know what? You can control a company with 70%. But somehow they feel the urge to almost have complete control of the company. So am I willing to believe that that part of the allegation is true, that they might have been at 76% and they used it, the shell company started? Absolutely. That's not a price manipulation argument. That's a rule-breaking argument. We could talk about what the penalty for that should be. So it's a mix of serious stuff with not so serious stuff with, hearsay is the best way I can describe some of the stuff. Somebody told the group that somebody had told them that there were crooked things going on. This could never be accepted in a court of law. But when you're a short seller, you can talk about guilt by association. And you see that in the report, right? The brother, cousin, somebody else who's done something wrong, and the Adani group has connections to them. So by guilt by association, it must be the sins of the Adani company too. So as I read the report, there's a lot of bullet points there where I look and say, I'm not sure what that tells me about the company, and I'm not sure that that's uncommon. That is that uncommon with an Indian business to begin with. Now we can talk about whether that's good or bad. That so many Indian companies follow these practices, but I have a feeling that the Adani group has been caught in a web of their own making. That desire for control has led them to cut corners on things, and that's now going to come back. And it's already haunting them because a short seller has taken those things and said, this must mean, because the two biggest allegations to me were the price manipulation, which is serious, and the other is that they're manipulating the financials of the underlying companies, make the company look more, their earnings manipulation, that the revenues are being pumped up. And that part I find puzzling, because if they're manipulating earnings, they're doing an awfully bad job of it, because Adani companies are not profitable. Their margins are tiny, they're struggling to make money. So if you're manipulating earnings, I'd have expected you to do a much better job and report 10% margins, not 3.6% margins.
So cut corners is the word that you've used, which you believe that the report seems to suggest. Let's then talk about that. Given the manner in which this has played out, should the regulator have intervened earlier when the stocks seem to be rising to abnormally high levels? Does this show somewhere that the regulator has not done enough to investigate or inquire into some of the troubling issues that are being raised only now?
Probably. But I think it's less to do with corruption and politics and more to do with inertia and indifference. I mean, I know how regulators work. They're risk averse, and especially in India, if you're a regulator, you want to make sure you don't take an action where you face the downside. So it's almost a system that's tilted towards inaction. So if there's a fault here, it's because we've designed a system where we tied the hands of regulators, and it's easy to pick on them and say, you should have done this, you should have done that. But if they get the downside of their actions, why would you ever expect them to go out of the way? So they're going to take narrow views of the rules because that's the safest place for them to be. So I think that's a more a reflection of how Indian regulation works and how the system is set up to punish people who go out of their way to try to be creative and try to catch companies. They get punished. So why would you ever go out of your way to do it? You're going to check the box and say, you know what, they checked the box. It's not my fault. So I attribute that more to indifference and inertia than to any degree of corruption. I could be completely wrong on this one, but I don't think that it was corruption or politics that was the driving force. It might have contributed that they have connections. But I think it's less that and more the indifference and inertia that is so much at the heart of Indian regulation.
I'm going to come to those political connections, Professor, later, but you're saying inertia or indifference on the part of the regulator prima facie. The other big question, do you see Gautam Adani company's high debt as a concern or as a normal given the infrastructure areas in which he has bet big on? Is that something that should concern people who've invested in Adani companies or are leveraged to Adani?
It's normal and it's concerning. They're not either or, right? I mean, in a sense, infrastructure companies always borrow a lot of money. And they're at the mercy of the regulators because they often run quasi-utilities. An airport, for instance. You can't give a private company complete power to raise prices, right? Because if you did that, you'd be driving airlines out of gates and, charging customers 3 times more. So the businesses that the Adanis are in are low margin businesses, even in their best days, but they're very, very capital intensive businesses. And for whatever reason, and this is not the Adani's fault, going back 100 years, infrastructure companies have always used a lot of debt. They've used a lot of debt because their view is once we build it, then we'll find a way to keep paying the interest. And you can't just blame the Adanis. Banks lend not based on earnings power or cash flows. They like to lend on big physical assets, right? Look at the real estate business. If you think about cash flows, nobody should be lending on Mumbai real estate. There isn't enough rental income in an expensive piece of real estate property. But you know what? Bankers like to lend on big physical assets. Infrastructure businesses feed on that. So and I don't think you can make that a crime. You can argue that this is a bad risk. You should not be borrowing so much money that your operating income is only 1.4 times your interest expense. There's not much buffer. That's a debate worth having, not just about the Adani Group, but about infrastructure businesses collectively. No, I think that the debt is concerning as an investor, but it's concerning to me across a whole range of infrastructure companies, not just the Adani Group.
Do you see, Professor Damodaran, anything unusual though in the manner in which LIC invested in the Adani Group, or indeed in the manner in which State Bank of India gave loans to the Adani Group, gave them these large borrowings despite the high debt that the company had? Is that exposure to Adani a risky one?
Perhaps, no. But you know what? LIC has made a lot worse investments than the Adani Group. I'll wager, if you look at the cost at which they got those shares and what their shares are worth today, it's one of the better investments that the LIC has made over the last 20 years. For as long as the LIC has been around, it's been our investor of last resort, right? Basically, the government has forced the LIC to invest in every bad company that needs money. The Adani Group is not one of those companies. So if LICs invest in the Adani Group, I'd be interested in what motivated that investment. But by itself, you know, it's one of India's biggest institutional investors. Adani Group was one of the, in terms of market cap, one of the biggest Indian companies. Any market cap weighted fund is going to have a lot of Adani in it.
What effects, Professor, then do you see the controversy having on the Adani Group and its expansion plans going ahead? Could this be, in a sense, the end of the Adani story?
It's going to slow it down. It's going to slow it down. I mean, there's no way around it, right? It's going to slow it down because you've put a seed of doubt in. And the problem when you build a company that's complex, that's opaque, which is what the Adani Group is, and family groups in India in general are opaque groups because it's self-protection. You don't want people to see what's going on the inside. When people plant a seed of doubt, the doubt is very difficult to remove because people can't see into your firm. It's one of the consequences of building opaque organizations. In good times, people don't notice. In bad times, people assume the worst about you. So the next few weeks are going to be very telling for the Adani Group because people are going to assume the worst. Every news story is going to be parsed for, hey, are they hiding something from us? So if I were advising the group, I'd say get ahead of this. Don't play the patriotic card in this one. No, don't tell it's a foreigner who's come in and tried to ruin you. The best solution here is to open things up, get more transparent about everything from ownership to financials to debt. And let people see, because even if there's stuff to hide, it will not be as bad as what people assume you're hiding. So even the bad stuff, bring it out. Have some credibility, let it play out. But it is going to create some punishment. It's going to slow the process down. I mean, I already read, I think today, that they were slowing down their capex, and that's exactly what you're going to expect to see in the next few months as they try to work themselves out of this problem.
So you're saying the Adani story will slow down, not be over. They have valuable assets. Now, you answered a bit of this question, but I still want to turn to it. There has been a response from the Adani Group and their supporters that this is an attack on India and the India story. Do you really believe this is an argument that should be made? Does this argument hold any water?
It's a very unhealthy argument, right? Because it basically says you can't bring up. I mean, I believe the India story, but it has seams and weak links. You know what the Adani Group does? It shines light on those weakest links. In fact, the way I describe the Adani Group is not a con, but it's a company that essentially has taken advantage of the weakest links in the Indian story and run with it. I think this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to say, look, this is a company. It's clearly, kind of pushed the limits of these weaknesses. And we want the India story to be a story that plays out over the next decade. We need to start working on fixing these weaknesses. Like what I think family group companies are there's some, not all of them. Some of them are run by very professionally. They're run as if, and there's some good things that come with family group companies. But there are family group companies in India that are obsessed with control. Everything the company does is about control, more control. And I think that's going to slow India down. You cannot have that be the driver of the economy. On markets, one thing that's always troubled me about the Sensex and the kind of psychology around Indian stock markets is if you're a bull, you can make up stuff and everybody goes along. You're a hero. Look at how many Indian bulls we've celebrated through the ages, right? From Rakesh Jhunjhunwala to anybody who talks markets up, even if there's absolutely no fundamental behind it, we celebrate. If anybody brings up anything bearish about stocks, that's almost considered to be, you can't do that. I think we need to allow people to be open about companies that need to be questioned. We need to have markets where we don't treat people who are bearish as somehow bad people who need to be pushed out of the game. They have a role to play as well. And on the regulatory institutional bank side, I think we need to kind of push against inertia and indifference. We need to push for regulators who take the best actions they can given the information they have, and when they make mistakes, you don't drag them in front of Parliament and accuse them of every ulterior motive, because they are going to make mistakes. The nature of regulation, when you're doing it well, is sometimes you're going to screw up, and you got to accept that that is part of the cost of having a regulatory system that's dynamic.
My final question, Professor Damodaran, and this really is the elephant in the room. Could the Adani Group have grown in the exponential manner it has over the last decade without its political connections, networks, especially to the Modi government? And do you believe this in itself needs to be investigated as part of some joint parliamentary committee or parliament, or at least some kind of oversight over how does one company seem to get so many projects?
What are they going to investigate? Of course, we know there's a connection. Of course, connections pay off in infrastructure. But here's the reason I think you can't get very far. Nobody wants to be in the infrastructure business. I come to India only once every 6 months or once every year, and we all know that India's biggest, weakest link is its infrastructure. I flew into Chennai airport that stayed under construction for a decade. And even after it was constructed, you had no idea what the construction was leading to or where it was going. The Adanis have entered a business where nobody wants to be. So if you tell me there are 15 people bidding for these airports and somehow, this was a bad bid and was picked, I'd like to see the evidence. I don't think it's likely. This is a business where there are very few competent players in India. And one of the tragedies that I see coming out of this is you might take a player I think there's a pathway. I don't even know why the Adanis went public, to be quite honest. I think they could have stayed private. Clearly they do something right in the infrastructure business. But I think this is what happens. An ambition and control kind of come together and you tend to overreach. So you can have I am not a great believer that parliamentary investigations lead anywhere, because politics means you dig in your heels. You basically, your side is right, the other side is wrong. They cast more noise than light on the process. So I'm sure there will be an investigation. It's not in your control or my control. There'll be a group of people. These will be, congressmen who have no idea what questions they're asking about infrastructure. And they will be given answers that they don't quite understand. And each of them will get up and make a speech on their own based on their side of the. But I think that you really don't need an investigation. Of course, they had political connections. Did it play a role in how quickly they grow? Absolutely. We all know it. We knew it before the Hindenburg report came out. So this has never been a secret. So what's the investigation going to prove? Unless there's something that was underhanded that happened, and I think that's worth exploring, it is what it is.
Which is why I say, in conclusion, if their corners were cut, if there is something underhand, whether it is regulators, whether it is these family-owned companies, Professor Damodaran, especially those in the infrastructure sector with political connections, do you believe it's time now that this is providing a wake-up call? And unless the system plugs in the loopholes, we'll have more such Adani-like cases emerging. Rather than sort of demonize only an individual, this system needs to be completely overhauled. Would you agree?
Exactly. I agree entirely, right? This is not about a company. This is about an India that still has legacy problems that go back not 10 years, not 20 years, but hundreds of years, right? A legacy problem where social networks are greater than financial networks. Bankers lend based on who they know, and that system is not going to go away just because we decide it wants to go away. So I think it's incremental. It's a process. I think the India of today is much better than the India I left 45 years ago in terms of those networks and being able to break into the business. And I think we need to recognize how far India has come rather than complain about how far behind it is, because both of those statements are true. And you can't abandon one without bringing in the other. So I think it is an opportunity. It's a chance for India to take a look at how it can be better. And, I think that the India story has legs as long as India doesn't cut its own legs off. And there's a history of doing that before where, I've seen over the last 40 years, the India story is coming. And then all of a sudden, 3 years later, you just basically, something happens, something catastrophic, where India self-inflicts enough wounds that it goes back to the start of the race. I hope that doesn't happen this time, that this doesn't become another political football that gets kicked around where you blame people on both sides. And that's part of the reason I don't want to have anything to do with the political side of this debate because it's going to be toxic. But I think there is a debate about how do we make India a better economy? How do we create an environment where we have more businesses? And most of all, how do we create an environment where our infrastructure is going to get built? Because sure as heck, the government is not going to do it. They don't have the money. So we need private companies to do it. And many of them are going to do what the Adanis did, borrow a ton of money, borrow to the hilt because that's what they've been taught as a way of funding these businesses. So I think it's an opportunity. I just hope we view it as such rather than a threat from outside forces that has to be stopped at any cost.
Okay, Professor Damodaran, your views, of course, will gather a lot of attention, but you help to cut through some of the political clutter, and it's always good to talk to someone who's been tracking valuations and indeed finances of businesses for years. Thanks very much for joining me there from New York.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.